The morning of July 20, 1942, broke hot and stifling across the South Pacific. On Español, something extraordinary was underway, where dense jungle had stood only 20 days earlier. American bulldozers were finishing a 6,000-foot airstrip. A detachment of the 3rd Naval Construction Battalion, using 6 tractors, 2 scrapers, and 387 men, completed in days what Japanese doctrine insisted would take months and vast labor resources. No Japanese diary describing this specific achievement survives, though Japanese intelligence would soon become aware of it. Captured documents and post-war interrogations show that Japanese planners had grievously misjudged American construction power. Pre-war ATIS translations preserved expectations that American forces would need a year or more to prepare offensive operations after securing ground. Actual events demolished that assumption. The record of Japanese encounters with U.S. construction units survives not in polished memoirs or detailed diaries, many of which were lost, but through American construction logs, changes in Japanese strategic choices that reveal a dawning recognition, and the few Japanese sources that remain. The tale is best told with statistics and operational outcomes. Japanese commanders confronted a reality more damaging than any single battlefield defeat, an opponent whose industrial and engineering reach far outpaced their expectations. Japanese forces first faced American construction on a large scale during the Guadalcanal campaign, though they did not immediately grasp its full implications. When Marines landed on August 7, 1942, they seized an almost finished Japanese airfield at Lunga Point. The Japanese had employed 2,774 workers, 1,379 Japanese, 1,145 Koreans, and 250 local civilians, who labored for over a month to build what became Henderson Field. Within 6 days of the landing, Americans had the field operational. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion, the first construction unit to see combat, arrived on September 1, 1942, with 387 enlisted men and 5 officers. What followed established a pattern repeated across the Pacific. Naval Construction Battalion records show these units immediately enlarged and repaired Henderson Field even while enduring daily enemy attacks. Japanese planes from Rabaul launched noon raids with Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, and on the night of October 13 to 14, Ijo Sirar, the battleships Kongu and Haruna fired hundreds of 14-inch shells into the airfield, gouging 53 craters in the runway. By dawn of October 15, the runway was back in service. Japanese reactions reveal their growing alarm at this construction ability. Admiral Yamamoto shifted the combined fleet's primary task away from supporting ground forces toward destroying Henderson Field. The Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer, runs limited in cargo capacity and unable to transport heavy equipment, were a direct response to the threat Henderson posed to slower transports. That logistical upheaval, caused by a single, rapidly built and persistently maintained airfield, contributed directly to the isolation, starvation, and eventual defeat of Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. Colonel Kanao Ichiki, who led the first major Japanese counterattack against Henderson Field, was convinced his 917-man detachment could retake the position. His force was annihilated at the Battle of the Tenaru. On August 21, 1942, Ichiki's personal papers were lost with him, and captured operational orders from his unit show no appreciation for American construction potential. The Japanese expected a partly finished, lightly held strip, but found a working base hosting 31 Marine aircraft. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army, launched 3 major attempts to recapture Henderson Field between August and November 19, each built on the assumption that damage to the airfield would take weeks to repair. After the October naval bombardment, the campaign's most intense, Hyakutake staff estimated the field would be unusable for at least a week. Its restoration within hours forced a wholesale reassessment of American capabilities that resonated through Japanese planning. As U.S. forces pushed into the Central Pacific in 1943, the gap in construction power became ever more obvious to Japanese defenders. The Gilbert Islands campaign offered a stark example at The 74th Naval Construction Battalion landed with the Marines during the November 2023, 1943, assault. Japanese defenders of roughly 5,000 troops from the 3rd and 7th Special Naval Landing Forces had spent months fortifying Betio and had hand-built a 4,500-foot airstrip over several months. The construction battalion had the battle-damaged field operational in 15 hours. That 15-hour timeline is not propaganda or estimate, but documented in official battalion action reports. Few Japanese diary accounts survive from defenders who witnessed the work. Most died in the island's final banzai charge, but Japanese high command quickly understood the strategic consequences. Later captured intelligence shows Japanese staff officers calculating that Americans could now establish air superiority over captured ground in days rather than weeks or months. Early 1944 Marshall Islands operations reinforced this new reality. At Kwailine, the 121st Construction Battalion converted captured Japanese facilities into a significant aviation base even while fighting continued nearby. Notably, the 110th Naval Construction Battalion repaired and expanded a damaged Japanese runway into a 6,800-foot bomber strip capable of supporting B-24 operations against truck. The scale of Japan's intelligence failure on American construction is clear in translated files from the National Institute for Defense Studies archives. Pre-war Japanese estimates projected U.S. merchant shipping construction at 5 million tons for 1943. Actual American production reached 19.2 million tons, nearly a 400% undercount. Similarly, Japanese intelligence predicted the U.S. Navy would number 13,070 officers and 296,000 enlisted by December 1943, while actual figures showed 219,279 officers, 120,472 officer candidates, and 234,343 enlisted men, far larger than estimated. Nowhere was this misjudgment more consequential than in construction. Japanese doctrine and training manuals allowed months for major airfield work because planners lacked any framework for mechanized rapid construction. Japanese engineering detachments captured in the Solomons labored with rudimentary hand tools, hundreds of shovels, a few hoes, and limited rollers, and could not imagine American aviation engineer battalions arriving with more than 140 vehicles and over 200 pieces of heavy construction equipment apiece. The Marianas Campaign in summer 1944 sharpened this strategic disparity, since those islands would host B-29 bases for strikes on the Japanese home islands. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of the Japanese 43rd Division on Saipan, witnessed American construction feats that contradicted every assumption of Japanese military experience. Saipan's Aslito airfield fell to U.S. forces on June 18, 1944. Just 3 days after the invasion began. Within 4 days, elements of the 3rd Battalion, 20th Marines, together with the 121st and 18th Construction Battalions, had the field ready for P-47 fighters. By July, even while fighting continued in Saipan's northern mountains, the runway was being enlarged to handle B-29 The first B-29, Jolton Josie, of the 73rd Bombardment Wing, arrived on October 12, 1944. General Saito did not live to leave a memoir. He took his own life on July 7, 1944, as American forces closed in. Yet his last orders, preserved in translation, show he understood the significance of rapid airfield construction. The savage enemy assault continues, and a general allowed attack is expected. I will defend the sovereign domain to the death. I will never accept the shame of capture alive. Saito realized Saipan's airstrips would put Tokyo within bomber reach, but he could not fully imagine the scale of build-out that followed. Turning Saipan into a principal B-29 base required moving millions of tons of coral and soil. Construction battalions ran Caterpillar D7 and D8 bulldozers for 20 hours a day, reserving for hours for upkeep. A D8, with 148 horsepower and hydraulic controls, could substitute for hundreds of manual laborers. The Japanese had no equivalent. Interrogations of a captured 17th Setai construction unit in the Solomons listed their equipment as 5 trucks, a single steamroller, and hand tools. Japanese commanders on Saipan had planned for months to fortify positions. American construction battalions produced multiple usable airfields in weeks. Even more disorienting to Japanese officers was the Americans' ability to build under fire. Japanese doctrine exalted the warrior spirit, Yamato Damashi, over material advantage. Yet on Saipan, they saw engineers who were both fighters and builders. The 121st Construction Battalion, originally attached to the Marines, fought as infantry while operating heavy equipment, combining combat grit with technical skill in a manner unfamiliar to Japanese military practice. If Saipan shocked Japanese planners, neighboring Tinian overwhelmed them. The engineering effort there ranks among the fastest and largest military construction undertakings in history. From July 1944 to May 1945, the 6th Naval Construction Brigade, about 15,000 men, turned Tinian into the world's largest bomber complex. Naval Construction Battalion records still astonish. Multiple 8,500-foot runways were hewn from jungle and coral. Northfield contained 4 parallel runways capable of launching B-29s for the 3,000-mile round trip to Japan, and Westfield added 2 more. The volume of coral excavated, blasted, and compacted equaled filling Hoover Dam 3 times. Japanese forces on Tinian, under Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata, numbered roughly 9. Most perished defending the island, yet American construction speed was evident even amid the fighting. Construction battalions landed with the assault on July 24, 1944, and by August 1, while Japanese troops still held the southern sector, American engineers were repairing, and lengthening the former Japanese fighter strip at North Field. Japanese airfield construction on Tinian had been done over many months, using forced labor from Chamorros and Koreans. A captured Japanese engineering report, translated by Addis, described manual coral crushing, hand-mixed concrete, and picks and shovels as the primary tools, estimating that extending a runway by 1,000 feet would need 1,000 laborers working for 2 months. American battalions added 4,000 feet to Tinian's runways in under 30 days. The psychological effect of this capability on captured Japanese personnel appears in Office of Naval Intelligence interrogations. While those sessions centered on military matters, several prisoners independently expressed astonishment at American equipment. One seized member of a Japanese construction unit summed it up. "We could not compete with the U.S. Navy method that used bulldozer and power shovel versus our method that used shovel and scoop by humans." Lieutenant General Tadamichi, commander of the garrison on Iwo Jima, perhaps understood American industrial strength better than most. He had served as a military attaché in Washington from 1928 to 1930 and traveled widely in the United States, and his letters home, later published, offer rare Japanese perspectives on American capacity. When American Marines assaulted Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, Kurabayashi commanded roughly 21,000 defenders and had spent months converting the island into an underground fortress. Japanese construction units had dug 11 miles of tunnels, created subterranean command posts, and concealed artillery, one of Japan's most extensive wartime engineering efforts, built over many months. The American response reflected a different construction philosophy, prioritized speed and machine power rather than concealment and manual labor. The 31st and 133rd Naval Construction Battalions landed with the assault. The 133rd, attached to the 4th Marine Division, suffered the highest losses in battalion history, about 40 killed, 156 wounded, and 48 evacuated sick out of roughly 1,100 men. But, despite casualties and persistent fighting, work continued at rates that would have baffled Japanese engineers. Within days of the landings, damaged Japanese airstrips were being repaired. By February 26, just 1 week after D, the first American aircraft, an OY-1 artillery spotter, landed on the restored field, and by March 4, while combat still raged, the first B-29 made an emergency landing after being damaged over Tokyo. Hurriedly repaired Iwo Field saved that plane and its crew. Kurabayashi did not survive to record reflections on US construction power. He fell in the final Japanese assault on March 26, 1945. His pre-invasion assessment, preserved and later translated from Japanese archives, acknowledged American material superiority. The enemy's offensive power and equipment are superior, and it is difficult for us to match them. What he could not have foreseen was the speed of construction while under fire. One concrete example highlights the gap. Japanese troops on Mount Suribachi had spent 2 years trying to build a road to the summit. Within 2 weeks of capturing the peak, American construction battalions had bulldozed a road to the top. Of feat marine historians recount as having moved a captured Japanese officer to tears, though the identity of that individual cannot be verified in available records. By the end of the battle on March 26, over 2,400 B-29s would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima, saving about 27,000 airmen. Those airfields were built and kept operational amid constant enemy fire, something Japanese doctrine had not imagined possible. The Okinawa campaign, which began April 1, 1945, provided Japan's last major frontline observation of American construction prowess. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior operations officer of the Japanese 32nd Army, was unusually well placed to perceive and later describe these capabilities. Unlike most senior Japanese officers, Yahara survived Okinawa and wrote The Battle for Okinawa, offering one of the few detailed Japanese accounts of American operations. Yahara had been an exchange officer in the United States from 1933 to 1935, studied at Fort Sill, and toured American military facilities, so his pre-war grasp of U.S. capabilities was more informed than most. Yet what he saw in Okinawa still exceeded expectations. Within hours of the April 1 landings, American forces captured Kadena and Yontan airfields, which the Japanese had inexplicably left largely undefended. By April 3, construction battalion units from the 58th Battalion and the 1901st Aviation Engineer Battalion were repairing and lengthening both strips, and within a week, American fighters operated from them to provide close support to ground troops. The scale and speed of the construction that followed on Okinawa were unprecedented. Ultimately, some 95,000 Army and Navy construction personnel would be committed to Okinawa, with plans to support as many as 4,000 aircraft. The 8th, 70th, and 11th Naval Construction Brigades were tasked not only with runways but with building whole port complexes, ammunition depots, hospitals, and supply hubs, in effect erecting a fully functioning military city amid the fighting. While the battle continued, Yahara's memoir records an increasing recognition of American superiority in base building, even as he concentrates on tactical and strategic issues rather than engineering minutiae. He observes that U.S. forces could stand up operational bases faster than Japanese units could organize counterattacks, and his account of the April 19th Japanese underscores the futility of striking positions that were being continuously reinforced and resupplied through installations erected. In short, order what Yahara saw but struggled to put into words was a deeper contrast in military outlooks. Japanese doctrine prized the spiritual element the warriors resolve over material power, while American practice fused combat strength with industrial logistics. Construction battalions were combat engineers who fought with rifles and ran bulldozers with equal competence, bringing civilian construction know-how directly into frontline operations. Japan had no true counterpart. Its construction detachments were either small engineering units with scant machinery or coerced civilian laborers with no fighting training. Captured units from the Solomons were found to possess only minimal gear and no combat preparation, essentially labor gangs rather than the battle-tested builder. The Americans fielded. Only after the war did the full scale of Japan's intelligence misjudgment about US construction become evident. The Strategic Bombing Survey, 1945-46, post-war interrogations of military and civilian officials, and translated captured documents revealed how fundamentally Japanese planners had underestimated American industrial and construction potential. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukuomi, former Combined Fleet Chief of Staff, conceded in post-war questioning that Japanese naval strategy had never anticipated the pace at which the United States could establish bases. Pre-war Japanese doctrine assumed that seized islands would remain effectively static defensive positions for months, while reinforcements and fortifications were prepared. The U.S. capacity to convert seized terrain into forward offensive bases within days or weeks rendered that entire strategic assumption obsolete. Statistics make the mismatch obvious. Where Japanese planners estimated a 6,000-foot heavy bomber runway would need 3,000 to 5,000 laborers, working 3 to 6 months, American construction battalions completed comparable projects with roughly 1,100 men in 20 days. A 5-2, 6-fold efficiency advantage. The machinery gap amplified this. A single D8 bulldozer could move more material in an hour than hundreds of manual laborers could in a day, and by 1944, U.S. forces in the Pacific had hundreds of such machines. Japan had so few bulldozers that captured Allied equipment was among its most coveted spoils. Those differences reflected deeper industrial and organizational contrasts. Japanese military construction remained anchored in traditional, civilian-style methods: manual digging, human-powered transport, and hand tools, partly from shortages, but also because manual toil was culturally framed as character building and an expression of spiritual resilience. American battalions, by contrast, were recruited from civilian construction trades and transplanted industrial practices into military projects. Time and strict maintenance regimes, standardized procedures, prefabrication and mass-produced systems became routine. Master matting, Quonset huts, and modular fuel tanks could be factory-made and shipped as ready systems. Japan relied on local materials and bespoke work for each site, which slowed and complicated construction. Operationally, that meant the U.S. could reproduce fast, reliable bases across diverse islands while Japanese construction was slower and inconsistent. The psychological effect on Japanese troops and planners shows up in the fragmentary evidence that survives: prisoner interrogations, seized letters, many censored, and later testimony, which together trace a trajectory from initial confidence through puzzlement to despair. Early victories and doctrines that celebrated Yamato Damashi bolstered faith that spirit could overcome material shortcomings. But the first encounters with American engineering at Guadalcanal began to erode that certainty. The rapid completion and resilient repair of Henderson Field under bombardment revealed an organizational and industrial depth Japan could not match. And by 1943, interrogations and captured documents record growing Japanese awareness of U.S. technological superiority. Captured construction personnel repeatedly expressed astonishment at bulldozers and power shovels, replacing shovels and human scoops. Each newly seized airfield became an operational platform within days, enabling the Americans to leapfrog across the Pacific and turn lightly held islands into staging points for subsequent offensives. The deliberate Japanese defensive perimeter intended to exhaust U.S. forces through protracted sieges was systematically undermined by this ability to build forward bases rapidly. The fall of Saipan in 1944, which placed the Japanese home islands within B-29 range, precipitated political fallout in Tokyo and demonstrated that lost islands immediately became springboards for direct strategic strikes. The construction of vast B-29 bases on Saipan and Tinian simply outpaced any Japanese countermeasure. By the late war, the psychological toll had reached the highest levels of command. Japanese strategy shifted from trying to prevent landings to seeking to maximize American casualties once ashore, a grim acknowledgement that the U.S. would establish lodgements and build the logistics needed to exploit them regardless of initial resistance. In short, the construction battalions did more than raise airfields quickly. They altered the conduct of the Pacific War by turning industrial construction and organization into decisive military levers. Admiral Chester Nimitz's choice to bypass Rabaul and isolate it rather than assault it directly depended on the ability to erect airbases on surrounding islands that could neutralize Rabaul by air power and operational approach, made possible only by rapid, mechanized construction. The compression of timelines was striking. Before the war, Japanese planners assumed any American push across the Pacific would be a slow, years-long campaign, punctuated by long pauses to build supporting bases. Instead, American forces moved from Guadalcanal to Okinawa over 3,000 miles in under 3 years, and each seized island quickly became the springboard for the next operation. At the same time, a sharp disconnect grew between what frontline Japanese troops encountered and what civilians at home were told, creating one of the conflict's major information vacuums. Strict wartime censorship routinely removed references to American machinery, construction speed, or material advantages from soldiers' letters. The few uncensored notes that survived, mostly those that never reached Japan, showed troops stunned by U.S. capabilities. But such first-hand impressions rarely penetrated the home front. Official propaganda continued to cast Americans as spiritually weak and overly dependent on material comforts. And Radio Tokyo broadcasts emphasized Japanese moral superiority over Western materialism, leaving the public unaware that U.S. forces combined rugged endurance with overwhelming industrial power. Even straightforward military reports were slanted. Saipan's fall was described as a heroic stand against great odds, with no mention that American forces were simultaneously building operational B-29 bases. And the swift Philippine campaign was attributed to sheer numerical strength, rather than the ability to erect forward bases at unprecedented speed. That information blackout had real consequences for morale. Japanese civilians remained relatively optimistic until heavy B-29 raids began in late 1944 and could not fathom how American bombers suddenly reached the home islands when the defensive perimeter supposedly held. They did not know that construction battalions had turned captured islands into enormous airbase complexes in a matter of months. The final tally of American construction across the Pacific helps explain Japan's strategic collapse. By war's end, Seabees and Army engineer strength totaled roughly 325,000 men, about 80% serving in the Pacific. They built 111 major airstrips and 441 piers, constructed ammunition magazines for 2,558 facilities and warehouses, covering some 700 city blocks, erected housing for 1.5 million personnel and fuel storage for 100 million gallons, and developed more than 300 bases across scores of islands. The hardware was staggering. More than 50,000 bulldozers were produced during the war, with thousands sent to the Pacific. And the Caterpillar D7, an indispensable work machine, could accomplish in hours what hundreds of manual laborers could not. Pierced steel planking revolutionized runway construction. Each sheet measured 10 feet by 15 inches, weighed 66 pounds, had 87 drainage holes, and by 1943, enough of this matting had been made to pave 240 runways of 150 by 5,000 feet each. With total production reaching 2 million tons roughly, the steel used for 600 Liberty ships, allowing cleared clearings to be converted to serviceable airfields in hours instead of days. The human performance figures were equally revealing. At Henderson Field, Seabees maintained and repaired the runway through 140 enemy air raids and 2 major naval bombardments. During the October 13th to 14th battleship shelling, they filled 53 craters and had the strip back in operation by dawn, a repair rate that outpaced the damage and lay outside Japanese wartime experience. Construction records are full of similar feats. The 20-day construction of the Espiritu Santo runway in July 1942 set an early standard. In 1943, the 47th Naval Construction Battalion laid a 3,300-foot runway on Vangunu Island in 9 days, and Tarawa's airstrip was rehabilitated and made serviceable in 15 hours in November 1943, showing that captured enemy facilities could be returned to use almost immediately. Tinian alone epitomized American construction scale. In less than a year, 15,000 Seabees built the world's largest airbase complex, and Northfield's 4 parallel 8,500-foot runways could launch scores of B-29s. Daily enough ordnance to overwhelm Japanese defensive capacity. Okinawa's transformation was even more extreme. Plans envisioned facilities to host some 4,000 aircraft, more than Japan had left in service, along with ports for the invasion fleet, ammunition stocks for the planned home island invasion, hospitals for expected casualties, and supply centers for millions of troops. The roughly 95,000 construction troops on Okinawa were building the logistical backbone for the projected final assault on Japan when surrender intervened. Although most senior Japanese officers who witnessed American engineering feats did not survive to explain their impressions. A convergence of U.S. construction records, captured documents, strategic choices by Japanese commanders, and scarce survivor testimonies form a persuasive account of how Japan experienced this threat. American timelines and statistics are precise. Shifts in Japanese strategy expose a growing recognition of construction centrality, and the limited Japanese testimony that remains conveys a mixture of professional astonishment and strategic despair. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara's memoir is uniquely valuable. His account of Okinawa describes Seabee work proceeding with mechanical exactitude, notes that engineer teams sometimes operated half a mile ahead of the fighting, and records surveying parties working in no man's land days before infantry advanced to mark future construction sites under fire. His post-war analysis concluded that American construction capacity had rendered the Japanese defensive scheme untenable, since any ground the Japanese abandoned would quickly be converted into a base for further US offensives. That realization came too late to alter outcomes but confirms that some Japanese officers understood the implication. Captain Rikagi Inagaki, a senior staff officer under Admiral Onishi and involved in planning kamikaze operations, survived and later observed that the U.S. ability to establish airbases rapidly had made traditional naval strategy obsolete, because every captured island immediately projected American air power farther west and contracted Japan's defensive perimeter faster than Tokyo could respond. The clearest Japanese technical appraisals come from engineers who served on fortifications. Post-war interrogations of surviving members of Japanese construction units recorded genuine amazement at American methods. One veteran of the captured 17th Setai reportedly likened watching U.S. construction to seeing the future machines accomplishing in hours what would have taken his unit weeks by hand. More persuasive than any single testimony are the operational choices. Japan made the decision to forego beach defenses on Iwo Jima and Okinawa in favor of fighting from prepared inland positions reflected an acceptance that Americans would establish beachheads and build support facilities regardless of how strongly initial resistance was mounted. That shift from trying to deny landings to maximizing enemy casualties acknowledged a grim new reality. Rapid mechanized construction made static territorial defense futile. Even the kamikaze campaign can be partly read as an attempt to counterbalance an adversary whose construction and logistical superiority undercut conventional responses. Traditional naval aviation depended on fixed bases, maintenance infrastructure, and trained support personnel sets the Japanese could no longer protect once. U.S. construction converted every captured island into an advanced operating base, as American construction battalions methodically pushed forward toward Japan, dismantling Japanese facilities and erecting new bases. The material foundation for conventional Japanese air operations crumbled. Kamikaze sorties, which required only one-way fuel and minimal upkeep, were a desperate effort to continue air operations despite the erosion of base infrastructure. Captured intelligence after the war shows Tokyo considered active countermeasures to Allied construction, plans for saboteur teams to wreck heavy equipment and kill operators, even proposals to contaminate work sites with chemical agents. Though these schemes were never effectively carried out, reflecting both Japanese weakness and effective American security. By 1945, Japanese homeland defense plans openly assumed that any American landing would rapidly produce vast base complexes regardless of resistance. So strategy shifted from preventing construction to making the Americans pay dearly while they built, hoping high U.S. casualties would force negotiations rather than unconditional surrender. By late 1944, Japan's leaders had belatedly grasped the strategic meaning of U.S. construction power, a recognition underscored politically by the fall of the Tojo cabinet after Saipan because B-29 bases now threatened the home islands. The ferocious defense of Iwo Jima, which inflicted some of the highest American casualties in the Pacific, was driven by the knowledge that the island's airfields would escort B-29s attacking Japan. Kurabayashi's move away from suicidal banzai charges toward a prepared defensive system acknowledged that the Americans would build airfields regardless, and that the only variable left was the human cost. Likewise, at Okinawa, the plan to hold out as long as possible while kamikaze strikes struck. US ships admitted the island would become a massive Allied base. Yahara's defensive design explicitly accepted that airstrips and ports would be established and sought, only to make their construction as costly as possible. The sequence from initial shock to reluctant adaptation shows Japanese forces did perceive and react to Allied construction capabilities, even if much direct documentation of their observations was destroyed. In this sense, Japanese strategic choices act as testimony. Actions reveal what missing written records cannot. The narrative of Japanese encounters with Seabee construction power is therefore told more by statistics and operational consequences than by surviving personal memoirs. Loss of records and the scarcity of first-hand Japanese accounts mean we lack intimate portrayals of individual soldiers and officers' reactions. But construction logs, strategic shifts, fragmentary testimonies, and post-war analyses together outline a convincing arc of recognition and consequence. Japanese troops witnessed something unprecedented: the full industrialization of military construction that enabled campaigns at speeds pre-war planners never contemplated. The 20-day Espiritu Santo runway, Tarawa's 15-hour rehabilitation, the vast B-29 complexes on Tinian, assembled amid combat achievements that were not merely engineering accomplishments but manifestations of organizational and industrial dominance that made Japan's position unsustainable once the Allies secured footholds. For Japanese professionals who perceived the implications, watching CBS build under fire must have been demoralizing. They were up against not only opposing soldiers but an industrial civilization projected across the ocean through bulldozers and prefabricated systems. Positions painstakingly constructed over months by hand could be equaled or exceeded by American engineers in days. The strategic effects were clear. Base construction enabled island hopping that bypassed, compressed the timetable of the Allied advance from years to months, and brought strategic bombing to Japan far earlier than Tokyo had expected. The surviving Japanese testimonies uniformly express amazement at Allied machinery and speed. Strategic responses show growing awareness of construction's role. Late war defenses at Iwo Jima and Okinawa acknowledged that Allied bases would spring up regardless of resistance, and the kamikaze campaign can be viewed partly as an asymmetric attempt to offset materially superior construction and logistics that could not be countered conventionally. The story concludes less with dramatic eyewitness accounts than with strategic capitulation to industrial reality. Emperor Hirohito's August 15, 1945 surrender broadcast referred to a new and terrible bomb and conceded that the war situation had developed unfavorably, an understatement that implicitly includes the Allies' unmatched capacity to project industrial power across the Pacific. The Seabees motto, "We build, we fight," signified a new military paradigm: combat engineers who could construct under fire at industrial tempo and, to Japanese observers, it must have seemed like fighting the future itself, where spiritual valor alone could not overcome bulldozers, prefabrication, and mass organization. The rapid construction of 6,000-foot airstrips in weeks was, therefore, both a practical enabler of Allied strategy and a symbol of a transformed kind of warfare that Japan's military tradition had not been prepared to contest. In the end, it was the convergence of industrial capacity, organizational skill, and frontline courage that decisively reshaped the Pacific War and left a legacy in modern military practice. Asterisk.